Good morning to everyone. Welcome to this webinar on information integrity in the G20. My name is Luca Belli. I'm professor at FGV Law School, where I direct the Center for Technology and Society. And I will be co-moderating this webinar together with my colleague, Professor Yasmin Curzi, also from FGV Law School. And the purpose of today's webinar is to try to understand which kind of interpretation of information integrity exists in the G20, or at least in some of the G20 members, and which kind of case studies and national policies, experiments, experiences could be used to inform the G20 process. Before we start, let me just do my administrative tasks and share our disclaimer, according to which all the participants to this webinar are participating out of their will. No one is forced. Of course, they are expressing their own opinion, and no element that will be circulated during this webinar represents an official policy of FGV. Let me just ask everyone to raise their thumbs up to make sure everyone agrees to participate willingly to this web. Now that we have shared our disclaimer, let me also stress that this specific webinar is part of our series of webinars on digital policies in the G20 that we organized together with the UN University e-government unit, Consumers International, and the Brazilian Institute of Consumer Protection, IDEC, and is also organized in the context of our project on media and democracy that on our side is directed by my colleague Yasmin. We have a very large spectrum of high-level speakers today to show us which are the complexities of this issue. We will have Menno from the European Commission that will join us in half an hour, Cristina Ruelas from UNESCO, Nicolas Suzor from the Meta Oversight Board, Rafael Evangelista from CGI, Nina Santos from Desinformante, Victor Piaia from the FGV School of Media and Communication, Agustina del Campo from Universidad de Palermo, CELE, and Merrin Muhammed from IT for Change, India, and last but of course not least, Camille Grenier from the Forum on Information and Democracy. Just as a starter, to set the scene and let the audience understand the kind of complexity we aim at untangling during the next 2 hours. Let me just share a little bit of food for thought for the next 2 hours, and then for our G20 leaders that have to think about which kind of policy may address this issue. Now, the first very important point I want to stress is that, as we all know, most people are increasingly dependent on social media platforms to seek access, information, to access information, and to share information. And this means that the impact that these entities have on people's life, on economies, on democracies, on society is particularly relevant, especially in a year where more than half of the world population has to vote, and most voters, they seek, impart, and receive information through social media, right? So to understand the complexity, here we have very few considerations that I want to throw at the speakers, maybe also to think about this in the Q&A at the end of their presentation. First, this webinar is on information integrity, but we all know that information integrity is not a universally defined concept. It has gained a lot of prominence last year with the UN Secretary General policy brief on information integrity, but the very same policy brief acknowledges that this is not a universally defined concept. to give you an idea, 2 years ago, only 2 years ago, with my colleague Yasmin and my colleague Professor Nicolas, we published this glossary on platform terms with 100 terms that we thought were essential to understand platform governance. And information integrity was not there because it was not even yet 2 years ago a widespread term utilized by policymakers. At the same time, we have platforms really shaping public discourse, shaping economies, shaping democratic processes. But this shaping primarily happens through very opaque AI systems, be them recommendation systems, algorithmic recommendation systems that are very opaque for the user, be them increasingly the production of synthetic content through generative AI systems. And again, these systems are very obscure for not only regular users, even for regulators, whose task is to exercise oversight on platforms. And last but not least, the so-called elephant in the room, the fact that most countries in the global south, users access internet through their mobile internet access, through their smartphone, that usually have prepaid plans. So that means that most users in the world access the internet having very limited allowance on internet access and having subsidized a very small set of subsidized applications, typically social media, that coincidentally are also the main vectors of spreading of misinformation, disinformation, hate speech. So this is a very important point that is usually absent from global north narratives, which is essential for the global south. So this makes us understand that the solutions we have to elaborate are very different when we are considering different types of countries, and they may be radically different in the global south from the global north, and pretty much no one at this stage has tried to address the entire complexity of the solutions that we have and the problems that we have at stake and the potential solution that we have. Now, as usual, I'm speaking too much, so let me pass the floor to my colleague Yasmin, and then we can start the debate.
Thank you, Luca. Thanks everyone for being here with us. So my name is Yasmin Curzi. I'm a professor at FGV Rio Law. I'm also a researcher at the CTS and coordinator of the Media and Democracy Project, who my colleague Luca just introduced to you. The Media and Democracy Project is a collaborative effort funded by the European Commission and developed in partnership with the Communication School of FGV, the fact-checking agency, Agência Lupa, and the Democracy Reporting International, DRI, who I'd like to thank for helping us in putting this event together. So the Media and Democracy Project, its main goal is to provide a comprehensive understanding of the communication scenario in the digital platforms. Our main activities consists in writing reports and other types of publications, white papers, and etc., to try to highlight the current scenario of digital communication, of digital democracy, and how democracy is being under coordinated attacks, and also its main institutions are being attacked within social media, and how platforms can help us in improving this scenario. So here we also focus on not only in disinformation, but also hate speech and online disinformation against online gender-based violence, against women in politics. And if you'd like to know more about our studies, they are published both in English and Portuguese in our website dedicated for this project, that is mediaedemocracia.fgv.br in Portuguese. And in this sense, this webinar, its main goal is to try to convene this panel of experts that are here with us today to try to highlight, to explore the role of digital platforms in protecting human rights and reinforcing democracy's foundations across the G20 nations, and also discussing the concept of information integrity that Luca mentioned to us. As Luca said to us, it is a new concept, that we are not with the foundation of this concept is still being discussed within academia. There's not many theories behind it, not many academic production on this. And so I'd like to first thank you all for being here with us, and to call the first speaker to give her presentation, Nina Santos, who is the coordinator of the Desinformation project and the Alafia Lab project too. I would like to invite her to take the floor, because I think she could give us a great overview of what the term information integrity means. Nina just wrote recently an article for Diplomatique, right, Nina? Discussing this concept, and I think it will be a great start for us today. Thank you so much, Nina.
Thank you, Yasmin, for the invitation to be here with all this great team and to share a little bit of what I have been working on and thinking about related to information integrity. So I'm very happy and very sad to be the first one to talk. Very happy because, well, nobody said anything, so I'm free to raise the issues that I want, but I'm also very eager to learn with everyone that is here. So I'm happy we will have some time at the end for the discussion. I would like to begin saying that I see the idea of information integrity in the context of the G20 as both an opportunity and also a challenge. And I would like to highlight that I would say that information integrity is more an idea than a concept, because I don't think it is yet well established and discussed to be a concept. Maybe I can be proven wrong, but that's my sense of the issue right now. But I think it does represent a lot of what has been going on in the discussion about what our society can be and what our democracy can be in the digital era. I think that's the discussion that is behind this idea. And I see mainly three opportunities in the landscape when we look at the idea of information integrity. The first one is to make a positive turn on the agenda. So we mainly have been talking about going against negative issues, so fighting against disinformation, countering hate speech and things like that. And I think in terms of public discourse, it's very important to have a positive agenda, so something that we can propose, defend, fight for. So I think that's very good in terms of agenda, and I think it makes sense to do this turn. A second opportunity I see is that apparently this term and this idea is gaining success in engaging different countries and different geopolitical interests. So apparently both in the G20 and in other international spheres, this idea has been gathering support from different sides. And of course, that's very important when we are talking about, real politics being done. We're not only talking about discussing theoretically a concept, but discussing how can countries agree on some terms and some premises to put forward policies. And the third opportunity that I see is the chance to advance in global actions towards the digital sphere, when localized solutions are important, but seem to sometimes generate more inequality. So I would like to mention a concrete example here because of some news that we just heard on the last few days about the end of CrowdTangle as a tool to access data from the Meta group. And I think that we can raise many issues about that, about transparency, access to data, research, journalism. But the point I would like to highlight here is that while today we have a first step on clear rules towards digital platforms in Europe, for example, via DSA and DMA. We do not have that in other parts of the world. So what is happening is that platforms, against their will, are kind of trying to adapt to the DSA, for example, but they are also saying that other countries that don't have any policies and rules about that, they just don't care. They are going to obey the rules that, you know, they have, but they are not going to care for the other countries that don't have rules. So I think that points in the direction that we really need to advance in global actions against these kinds of threats. And I think these are three great opportunities that are open and that can be reinforced by the discussion around information integrity in the G20 context and in other contexts. And I think at the same time, we do have many challenges that are put forward by this idea. The first one that really bothers me is the successive import of English terms that do not necessarily translate both in terms of language and imaginary to other realities. This was the case with fake news, which several authors pointed out that it doesn't have a Portuguese exact translation. So notícias falsas, for example, is not the same thing as fake news. It's the same case as misinformation, disinformation, malinformation that also doesn't have a Portuguese exact translation. So we end up putting everything in the same bucket as disinformação. And I think we really have a great challenge not to do this again with information integrity. And it's not only about a language translation, but a meaning translation, an imaginary translation that we need to build in a more democratic and diverse way, in my understanding. A second challenge is specific. I would like to talk specifically about the Portuguese translation. I know here we have views from different parts of the world, and that's great. But I would just like to mention that in Portuguese, the Brazilian government adopted the translation Integridade da Informação in many documents that have been published, which is, of course, an option for that translation. But there are also other translations like Integridade Informacional, for example, which is not exactly the same thing. And there's also the less widespread Integridade do Ambiente, or let's say, let me put it in English, integrity of the environment or the space or the ecosystem around communication. So the basic problem is that, once again, I fear that we are importing an external concept without much discussion, and that makes it difficult to choose a translation because we don't have established social meaning yet. So I think we have to profit from this opportunity to build this social meaning. And the third challenge that I would like to highlight, and let me see how much time I still have 1 minute, so I will finish almost with that. The third challenge that I think we need to face is the focus on the space and the flow of communication and not the focus on the unit. I think the idea of information integrity, and especially the Portuguese translation, Integridade da Informação, can give the impression that the focus is on the unit of information, which needs to be intact. In other words, there would be a sender, a producer of information, who would publish an information unit that should be protected and kept in its entirety until it is received. This idea is not really aligned with how we see the information ecosystem today, where the space, the intermediaries are very important to discuss if we are really having reliable and trustworthy information or not. So to finish, I think there is something that is a challenge and also an opportunity. I would put it as a challenge, but we can put it as an opportunity. That is that maybe we can build an information agenda from the South, not for the South, but from the South, where the majority of the world population lives in. And I think that the term information integrity tries to create a framework to build an imaginary of the digital space that we want. And we need to think, when we talk about the realities of the South that are often very much aligned with inequalities, with poverty, with violence, with the heavy use of messaging apps, as Luca was saying, in very recent and sometimes very fragile democracies, and especially that we are talking about countries that are physically and imaginary very far from the big tech company, the headquarters of the big tech companies. What do we really want and what do we really need from this digital environment and from this new communication environment? Maybe a way to move forward is to connect this with issues like fight against inequality, fight against climate denialism or environmental issues in a more broad sense, which are very much preponderant in our realities. Well, that was it. I'm happy to be here and to hear all of you, because I think that we have a great way in face of us to develop this idea and to build concrete actions around it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nina. And now, actually, it's good as a good follow-up. It's excellent to have Cristina from UNESCO, as UNESCO has been working a lot on the concept of information integrity, also on recommendations on platforms, also on creating working definitions of misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, which are considered as the main threats to information integrity. So please, Cristina, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Luca, Yasmin, for the invitation. We're very happy to be here, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to share this table with you and to be after Nina, and because it's very interesting what you mentioned, and it makes total sense for us, because one of the things that we thought when we were thinking about the Windowhead Declaration that is called information for as a public good, one of the main discussions about information as a public good was the translations in other languages. For instance, in Spanish, if it's bien público is not the same as common good, which will be the translation in English that was in the end up leading to. But I wanted to start with the Windowhead Cluster Declaration, because it's actually what led to the work that we have been doing on the guidelines for the governance of digital platforms and all of the other actions that we have been taken related to try to have a more holistic approach to address problems that have risen and during in the digital environment. And this is because when we think about information as a common good, it would be in Spanish, or public good in English, is because we thought that we shouldn't be thinking only on the digital environment, but to see an holistic approach, thinking that what happens in the whole information ecosystem goes beyond only the digital, but goes also in the realities, for instance, that journalists live all day during, like, media outlets, etc. So information as a public good encountered three main pillars that had one is media viability, of course, because we cannot ensure information integrity if we don't have the possibility for media to live and to keep the media running. And then we need also transparency for the digital from the companies. This is what Nina already mentioned about CrowdTangle and importance to gather data to understand a little bit more about the actions that the companies are doing in order to provide, let's say, reliable or accurate information outside. And then we had another, let's say, pillar that is the media and information literacy, and how the users have different tools to engage and to have agency in their interactions with digital platforms or with the products that they consume. So after this main discussion, we started a broader discussion on how to fit like these different concepts into a broader idea of what would it entail, what is actually entailing to have transparency on digital platforms, and is transparency enough? And what we realized during the process of the consultation of the guidelines for the governance of digital platforms is that first, there was a lot of already literature review actions that were taken by many actors that were discussing around digital platform governance, about what transparency, what information integrity would entail, how to address hate speech or disinformation, etc. But there were many different approaches to how to deal with these different problems. There was, for instance, people that will say that there should not be a coherent system of governance systems that would entail a statutory regulation, or that only self-regulatory mechanisms will prevail. So there was a lot of discussions around this. So UNESCO tried to gather as much information as possible in order to understand what was the big question around this. And what we finally got after the process of analysis of these different literature review, but also the consultation that we led during a year, it was that there was 5 main principles that companies should follow in order to ensure that the way that we interact in the digital sphere would be trustworthy. So one is transparency. They have to be transparent as well, is what everyone has been talking about. The Santa Clara principles have a lot to say around transparency, etc. But then we also understand that there were many discussions about human rights due diligence. But when we talked about human rights due diligence, we really didn't understand when it comes, what is the specific context nuances that had to be taken into account when it comes to risk assessments, because risk assessment doesn't depend directly on one specific moment or one specific group, but it depends on all of the context nuances that Nina highlighted, but also on changes of operations, changes of technology, and many other things. And sometimes it didn't seem that when we talked about risk management, we were thinking about all of these different situations. So risk management was one of the key elements of this new document that we were developing, of the guidelines for the governance of digital platforms. And then we had another principle that it is related to how digital platforms have established processes and systems to actually identify potential or content that could be permissibly restricted under international human rights standards. Because it's also important to say that not all of the content that we label as disinformation or as hate speech, it is permissibly restricted under international human rights standards. So we cannot be like just do a one size fits all. It depends. There's a lot of in different vectors that we have to take into account when it comes to this. So one of the things that we realize is that companies need to be accountable about the systems and processes that they have in place in order to moderate and create content, in order to make sure that the economics behind the interest that is legitimate from the companies affects different human rights. Then the fourth pillar was to actually make sure that companies work together with all of the other members of the society to develop a set of tools that enable users to engage in a better way with their products and services, to try to understand how they are doing it, and also to try to understand the behavior behind disinformation, hate speech, etc. What is that it leads this scale to be more high. Then the last thing is to make sure that all the accountability mechanisms that platforms have are actually accessible, because sometimes we thought, like what we heard during the consultation is that yes, they obviously have redress mechanisms. That doesn't mean that the redress mechanisms are in all languages, or that companies care that much about what we are doing in some country in Africa than what we are doing in France. So these are the different situations where the companies were facing different situations. So after that, what we realize is that also, as I said, in the case of the Window Head Plus 30, is not only a deal that has to do, and I think this is also one of the things why UNESCO is a knowledge partner of this process in the G20, is that it doesn't only depend on the companies. It also has to do a lot with what the governments are doing to enable the environment for freedom of expression, access to information, and to have a good governance system that is independent and that has the capacity to actually see and oversee how the mitigation measures that are put in place to reduce risk are not affecting other human rights, such as freedom of expression, access to information, privacy, or whatever other human rights. So for us, it is important to see always that the governance systems of digital platforms not only have to be coherent between the different mechanisms that are put in place to let's say, regulate, self-regulate, co-regulate digital platforms, but also have actions in between that are very well set within the governmental institutions, not only to ensure the independence of the regulatory mechanisms, but also to ensure that what they are doing are actually enabling the possibility to have an information environment that is integral, right? So the message at the end for us is that this is an holistic approach. There's not a solo solution. We need to come with different solutions that come from different sectors, different policies, from education, culture, communication, etc. But it is important to grow their decision, not just focused on the digital environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ana Cristina, for this wonderful overview about this crucial initiative that is the guiding principles on platform responsibilities by UNESCO. It is really vital for us to have a framework in order to push for more platform accountability. And following Ana Cristina's presentation, we have Nicolas Suzor here with us, with an awesome follow-up how these arguments were built really smoothly in order to flow with the presentations. So Nick is a law professor at the Queensland University, member of the Meta Oversight Board, and his work has been a great reference for anyone who's been working with platform transparency and platform responsibilities. So Nick I think can complement and is a great complement for this argument that has been built by both Nina Santos and Ana Cristina. So Nick, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me and for the generous introduction. It's great, as you say, to follow from both of the previous speakers who have done, I think, a really excellent job of explaining some of the complexities involved in this, in thinking about effects and responses and responsibilities between government, between platforms, between civil society and media actors, about who we think ought to do what to tackle information integrity problems. I was really struck, Ana Cristina says, we can't do one size fits all. And from my view on the oversight board, this is something that is incredibly important, that context really matters. And it is incredibly difficult to generalize out across all of the issues that we've been talking about today. The issues facing disinformation are different to those facing hate speech, are different to those facing abuse, are different to those facing about lack of access to information and infrastructure and telecommunications. They're also different from region to region, from country to country, and within countries, from between people and between language groups, between different cultural groups. So when we talk about information integrity, I see as well as others some potential, some useful potential from this way of thinking about these challenges as a set of information integrity challenges. But I also worry a little bit about what gets simplified under the term information integrity. Information integrity, I think, part of the reason it's attractive is that you can divorce it from some of the more difficult substantive concerns. Everyone agrees that integrity is a good thing, and that improving the integrity of information must therefore be a good solution to some of the challenges. What I want to raise is a few provocations about how difficult that gets when we start trying to actually get to the details about what we expect from different actors. So, for example, I think one of the challenges of information integrity might be that it pushes us towards technical fixes and simple measures that are broadly applicable to across these really different areas. So I think, to take one example, what we are seeing a lot of at the moment is responses to deepfakes, responses to synthetic media, and how to actually respond, like what actually works to challenge disinformation, and how we might scale up those sorts of responses is still a really unsolved challenge in many areas. But we do see around the world both governments and tech companies grasping for certain solutions, technical solutions to these fixes. And you can see why technical solutions to technical problems are attractive, but you can also read this as in some ways counterproductive to really the difficult political work of regulation and setting out and working through disagreements. So one of these solutions that we see a lot of is watermarking, the idea that you can attach an indelible ID to a piece of content, and you can guarantee its integrity by somehow having a secure chain of title and modification that really, to me, seems like a pipe dream, a technical pipe dream that we tried with copyright 30 years ago. The old problems of uncontrolled copying by having the same sort of provenance regimes that we're now talking about in watermarking terms, as if these technical solutions are likely to solve the underlying social problems. And I think that's one of the big threats of talking about integrity devoid of the contextual nuance and complexity, because the big questions are always social. What counts as mis and disinformation is really heavily contested. What is harmful is a function not of whether the information is necessarily true or not, but of how it's being spread, how it interacts within an ecosystem that is heavily influenced by governments, by traditional media, as well as by social media companies. It is really quite difficult to operationalize any sort of responses to these problems that is not really heavily contextually sensitive. So we are seeing movement by government, and sometimes this is great. Like, we are seeing governments become more sophisticated, but we also see that governments pose some of the biggest threats to information integrity, some of the biggest threats around the world to The elections, for example, come from intimidation from journalists and intimidation of journalists by government attempts to censor and silence critical speech. And a lot of that gets bound up with the debate about mis and disinformation. That language of mis and disinformation gets co-opted by governments that are hostile to speech and to democratic processes. At the same time, everyone has already noted, I'm out of time, but there is so much work to do to just understand the technical solutions. Automation is increasing so quickly, and transparency is something that we've been talking about in abstract terms, but still have not figured out how to actually do transparency in a way that helps us understand and answer the questions. What are the states doing? What are the companies doing? What is the shape of the automated responses? We've heard how varied we expect that to be from location to location. We know that the technical solutions are deeply flawed for many people in global majority countries. They're optimized for Western problems and Western solutions. And I just think that we have such a long way to go in terms of research, data access, and accountability to be able to have these conversations in any degree of sophistication that we need.
Thank you very much, Nick, for this very good points, bringing us into the core of the discussion, and first the need to contextualize, to understand to what extent the terms we are using that we may all agree upon about the beauty and the non-controversial character like integrity, then de facto when we have to specify what do they mean, that is the real problem, right? The devil is in the details, like terms like transparency. Everyone agrees that transparency is good, but then when we have to understand what is meaningful transparency about what, how, for whom, this is the core of the question. Then also to differentiate between different actors and different contexts in terms of not only cultural specificities, disinformation, they are highly contested concepts, but they can also be, in some contexts, be abused also to stifle certain types of speech. And this is why this the question of information integrity, and particularly the threats to information integrity being considered misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, is extremely tricky for pretty much all governments around the world, which are quite shy about adopting regulation and prefer to delegate to self-regulation or co-regulation, because as soon as you regulate, you will be immediately considered a censor by the opposition, and you will be accused of censorship by virtually everyone, including the platform themselves, as we have seen, especially in the Brazilian context, when a bill was introduced last year in May, and some platforms sent messages to millions, literally millions of users here in Brazil to contact their congressmen and ask not to approve the bill. Now, no one better than Rafael Evangelista, that is not only a professor, he's also part of CGI.br, that has been leading a very interesting consultation on platform regulation over the past year. So no one better than Rafael is well positioned to give us a little bit more context about these complexities at the Brazilian level. Please, Rafael, thank you very much for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Luca. I would like to start by expressing my gratitude for this kind invitation, naming Yasmin and Luca, and to congratulate the FGV for this initiative. I think it's crucial to address these issues within the G20 context, since aside from 2 or 3 nation states, a few countries worldwide can, without global coordination, autonomously handle the threats to democracy arising from misinformation. But let me start my comments with a brief disclaimer. Although I am a board member of CGI.br, I will not speak on its behalf. My comments stem from my experience as a professor at UNICAMP. Of course, I can talk about CGI consultation, etc., but I don't feel comfortable to speak on their behalf. But I'll speak here informed by my research on internet and platforms, as well as my students' research. Considering the current structure of global information networks, addressing misinformation requires global coordination. Like global economies, information and communication networks are interconnected, a result of a political economic project. Integrating global economies through communication networks has enabled some economic actors to exploit regional and regulatory differences more effectively. The web and platforms emerged from this context. When countries, like how Lucas said, when countries attempt to strictly regulate the information spaces, they often face criticism for infringing on free speech. However, regulating the informational ecosystem, given the business model supporting today's internet platforms, will certainly challenge economic interests and face significant obstacles. Early last year, I represented CGI.PR at the UNESCO Global Conference, Internet for Trust, and the conference was part of these efforts to promote a series of global consultations to define common guidelines for addressing this issue. However, I think a contradiction became apart in that event. The guidelines discussed contrasted with the majority of testimonies at the conference. Many speakers highlighted the link between the business model of social network platforms and the effects on misinformation and disinformation production. Yet the intended global guidelines mostly focus on content moderation and ensuring freedom of expression, together with transparency measures and necessary regulation of big tech. For example, Maria Ressa, a keynote speaker at the conference, noted how technology hacked our biology to bypass our rational minds, triggering our worst aspects to keep us scrolling in our information economy. Attention is the prize, she remarked, echoing over a decade of warnings from science and technology studies. Surveillance capitalism, or surveillance for profit, turned our world upside down, and my own research helped to support her remarks. Since at least 2018, I have been researching the link between misinformation and social network platforms, which utilize surveillance in their business model. In 2019, I published an article with my colleague in Latin America Network Studies on Surveillance Technology and Society, LAVITS, Fernanda Bruno. In that article, we aimed to explain the election of a far-right president in Brazil by examining his campaign use of chat groups on instant messaging apps. The article draws on ethnographic observations from participation in far-right groups, which I did, and also draws on analysis of images widely shared in WhatsApp chat groups during the election period. In that article, we illustrate how the far-right adapt WhatsApp and Telegram chat groups for their purpose, making these chat groups akin to social networks. We touched upon surveillance and visibility issues, noting the coordination among chat group members to control the narrative on these groups. Importantly, some members appear in multiple groups, creating an unseen network for the average user. This behind-the-scenes coordination remains hidden from the average users. Additionally, we emphasize how these groups become information sources for users, similarly to how they engage with social networks. So they get most of their information from chat groups, like they get information from the social networks. And this raises questions about the far-right's ability to control information flow on thousands of chat groups and the impact of this on other social networks. Having control over this network structure that operates on messaging applications means having the power to push certain content. These contents of videos, audios, or text may be uploaded directly to the messaging platforms, or they may be hosted on other platforms like YouTube, Facebook, or even the web. Pushing content to go viral in chat groups impacts the algorithm on platforms like YouTube. And when the algorithm detects content with increasing demand, it registers interest and begins to promote that content using the platform tools, suggesting the content to other users. And the platform audience this means that the platform audience is surveilled and receives content suggestion based on their potential interests. Thus, we have two layers of surveillance. One that happens within the chat groups by the far-right members, and surveillance and content suggestion working in synergy with the surveillance and content suggestion from platforms. And in my latest research, we are looking at Brazilian YouTube channels linked to the far right. And we have found some smaller YouTube content creators and sites that look like news outlets, but really are not news outlets, and that they have spotted and seized a business opportunity. They have shifted their content to appeal to the far right. So they was used to produce content of other issues, but now they produce content that pleases the far right. And this includes channels that used to focus on light entertainment or celebrity news, but now have turned their attention to political matters and significantly boosting their view count on doing that, after doing that. Our research reveals an extensive ecosystem of producers who follow teams and positions expressed by the former President Jair Bolsonaro supporters in chat groups, creating a significant echo chamber for the far right. This media production doesn't need direct financing, as profits come from platform monetization. And by highlighting economic interests, we are not dismissing political and ideological affinities between content producers and the far right. We recognize the complexity and variety of motivations that are involved in this process. But we want to underscore how this ability to control content distribution on chat groups by the far right serves as a major tool for recruiting media labor. Barely professional channels with low audience quickly became major players, surpassing traditional professional press viewership. On some channels, a controversial video can reach up to 1 million views just in a few hours if that video is chosen for circulation by the far right who controls these chat groups. So content creators have learned to make videos and posts that go viral, reaching as many people as traditional media. For example, during the pandemic, there was false claims about treatments and the number of cases and deaths during the COVID period. And these channels often spread misinformation and don't follow any ethical standards that are expected from journalist outlets. So, in conclusion, this comprehensive exploration of misinformation and its ties to surveillance capitalism underscores a critical challenge for our digital age. To safeguard democracy and the integrity of our information ecosystem, since we are talking about this integrity of the ecosystem, it's imperative that we address the dual threats posed by the financing of disinformation production and the profit-driven surveillance practices of online platforms. Halting these practices requires collective action and commitment to revising our digital economy's underlying structures, ensuring they serve the public interests over private gain. Only by confronting these issues head-on, we can hope to restore trust on our global information landscape. That's it. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm eager to talk more with all of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this such elucidative lecture, Professor Rafael. I think that the merely focus on the content layer, which the concepts of disinformation, hate speech, and others, we are mainly focusing until nowadays, until the emerging concept of information integrity, and we are still debating this concept too. But this focus on content specifically diverts our attention from the main issues that are economist attention, surveillance for profit, or surveillance capitalism, as you exposed, and how algorithms have their own role in promoting radicalization, as Professor Fernanda Bruno is also trying to highlight for us in her work. So to properly address these practices, we need to focus also in AI regulation, personal data protection altogether. And a work that I know is being conducted by the Forum on Information and Democracy, that is represented here by Camille Grenier, who is its operations director. So Camille, thank you so much for joining us here today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to have so many brilliant speakers, but it's getting harder and harder to share new thoughts. I'll try to do my best. Thank you so much for having me. I will get back, but really, Nina did a fantastic job on the terminology that we're using. I'll try to bring a few thoughts on that. And then talk specifically about the G20 and the Brazilian presidency of the G20, what we can expect from that and the work we're doing with the Brazilian government around the G20 presidency. First, I remember perfectly, and coming from France, I perfectly remember the first time I met this concept, term, or idea of information integrity, and I was really feeling maybe the same as you, Nina, that it doesn't translate well in French. Intégrité de l'information does not really work. And actually, I'm doing a little bit of background research on this concept, and it really seems that there is different conceptualization of information integrity. And for example, if you take a look at the UN Secretary General Policy Brief number 8 on the Code of Conduct on Information Integrity refers, I quote, to the accuracy, consistency, and reliability of information. So we're really speaking about the content itself. But if you look at the Global Declaration on Information Integrity that was endorsed by more than 30 countries, including Brazil, last September, the definition here is the term information integrity, I quote again, is defined in this declaration as an information ecosystem that produces accurate, trustworthy, and reliable information, meaning that people can rely on the accuracy of the information they access while being exposed to a variety of ideas. So there's really already on the international stage, two definitions of information integrity. And as for the Forum on Information and Democracy, we tend to be more on this ecosystemic and structural approach of the information space, as we see it more relevant to not only focus on the content, but rather on the overall structure and its impact on public debate and democracy. When we launched this initiative on information and democracy and the Partnership for Information and Democracy, that was really the ambition. We defined the information and communication space as a public good of humankind, and with this ambition that its management should be done by all relevant stakeholders and parties. In September last year, we were delighted to welcome Brazil as the 51st signatory state of the International Partnership for Information and Democracy, a partnership that outlines specific principles for a democratic governance of the information and communication space. And the implementation of these principles is facilitated by the Forum on Information and Democracy, an organization based in Paris. I've been pleased to run for a few years now. And we're focusing really much on providing policy recommendations periodic evaluations, and elevating the voice of civil society around the world, and with the disparities that we can have from a region to another in these debates. To now go to Brazil and the G7, sorry, not the G7, the G20 presidency, we can really see that the information integrity has become a key component of Brazil's foreign policy engagement. There is their participation in the Partnership for Information and Democracy, the endorsement of the Declaration on Information Integrity, a few bilateral cooperations, notably with Germany, the UK, Finland, and Denmark. President Macron is going to Brazil next week. It seems like this information will be also on the agenda. And to us, it was no surprise, though quite a bold move to add information integrity on the agenda of the G20, a group where you have countries that do not necessarily share the same vision for the information space. I was looking this morning at a few multilateral initiatives and their membership. And basically, when you look at the Freedom Online Coalition, the Global Declaration on Information Integrity, the Media Freedom Coalition, the Partnership, the Declaration for the Future of the Internet, you always see that amongst the G20, there are always 10 or 12 G20 members that have endorsed these different multilateral initiatives, and the rest that is totally absent of these multilateral initiatives. And so the question for the G20, and this is the work we're trying to do with the Brazilian government, is how do we bridge this gap? How do we have around the same table countries that do not have the same vision for the management of the information space? And I must say, it's really not easy if we don't want to end up with the lowest common denominator. So what we're trying to do with the G20 presidency is really to have this discussion with an ambitious goal that is framed within the Partnership for Information and Democracy, and also to strengthen the coordination between different international processes. And Cristina told about the UN work that is being done on platform governance. There is the Code of Conduct on information integrity, the work that we are doing notably with the Observatory on Information and Democracy, this idea of an IPCC, an evaluation mechanism for the information and communication space. And I think, to put it in one word, that and that's actually the topic of a session we'll be organizing in Santiago de Chile for the UNESCO conference, is seeking common ground. And how can we find some common ground on the management of the information and communication space? Notably because this is actually something we see very much in France, is that there is a militarization of the field, and more information is seen as a tool for foreign, and with the narrative that is gaining more and more, we're talking now about information warfare. Us as users of platforms, we are some of us consider users as soldiers of a war, and really there is this sort of tendency to militarize this field. One question that nobody is asking is, if we are at war in the information space, is how do we make peace? So hopefully the G20 will put things out there, and we will start to have this debate on the global stage. I think Brazil is very well positioned as a bridge between different views. And just a last word, it's been said a lot since the beginning of 2024. It's a crucial year because we have all these elections happening. It's also a crucial year in terms of the international agenda, and the UN agenda on this topic, with the Code of Conduct on Information Integrity, the Global Digital Compact, the Summit for the Future in September, the G20 presidency of Brazil. It's going to be a very crucial year for the future of the information and communication space and its management. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Camille, for providing this really fantastic connection of all the dots of the various international processes that are ongoing, the need also to try to streamline all these processes, because as you were very rightfully mentioning, even at the international level, there might be conflicting or overlapping definitions of terms, even elaborated by a very singular set of countries and parties. So it's I think I very much agree with you that the Brazilian presidency of the G20 this year will be also key to try to really bring a little bit of clarity. Of course, no one here expects the G20 to solve the problem of information integrity, but the greatest contribution of the G20 could really be to provide a little bit of clarity into what is an increasingly complex semantic and conceptual scenario. Now, to keep on this line of thoughts, I would like to give the floor to our colleague, Victor Piaia from the FGV School on Media and Communication, where they have been monitoring social media for years. They have an excellent work on this monitoring, and they are our very reliable partners in this media and democracy project. Please, Victor, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Yasmin, Luca, Julia, Lorena, for the invitation. It's a huge pleasure to be here representing the School of Communication, Media and Information of FGV. I will take advantage of the fact that we have different specialists on internet governance and regulation here to assume my main role as a sociologist, think more broadly on the challenge of the social flows of contemporary disinformation. I will talk about the Brazilian case, but I'm certain that I will talk about also the other countries' context also. So we have all followed the transformations in everyday communication and their consequences in the recent years. It's nothing new. Before say that contemporary information flows have radically altered ordinary people's access to content that used to be restricted to some niches of society. Conspiracy and radicalism have always been found in digital environments, and until the explosion of the platformization process, however, it required a lot of interest and an active search attitude to get this kind of content. Searching specialized forums and websites, downloading content from torrent applications, in other words, required proactivity and real interest on the part of the individual. In recent years, however, we've seen a huge transformation on these information flows. Based on WhatsApp groups, timelines, and other platform forums, this kind of content began to circulate in our everyday conversations. This has obviously increased the size of these radicalized and conspirational groups, but it has also made part of the less political. It has also made part of the less politically interested part of the population more susceptible to the influence of this type of content. Of course, the growth of radicalized groups and their influence on politics and information is a major problem for contemporary democracies, but I'm particularly interested and concerned to think of ways to avoid moments of overflow of these views to these less political engaged citizens. I believe that the 2018 elections were very significant in this regard. There was a general panic in part of the population, a sense of urgency and danger that captured much of the population and opened up a fertile ground for radical, fake, and conspiratorial narratives to gain ground in the wider public debate. Of course, this is related to a more general context involving deeper phenomena such as economic crisis, the growing influence of religious groups, among others. However, communication acts as a trigger to activate and bring all these processes together in a coherent perspective. In this sense, we have seen a great deal of attention paid in recent months to disinformation potential of generative AI. This is the fundamental and urgent problem, and the popularization of this technology opens up space for creativity, and that is simply unpredictable for us. Without detracting in any way from the potential of this risk, I would like to draw attention to a more well-known and mapped phenomenon, the circulation of conspiracy narratives accumulated over the years in digital environments that are used as a trigger in critical moments of the political life of the country. In this sense, we see at FGV School of Communication 4 major narratives that are usually used in these terms. First is the narrative about the fraud and the ballot boxes, the distrust of the electoral system, which is particularly mobilized during the electoral periods. In 2020, a local election, for example, we published a study showing how any small problem in the electoral process, I remember a small delay in counting, was quickly framed as a sign of fraud. And of course, for us in Brazil, it's kind of normal to think about it, but it's normal because we are already prepared to think in these terms and frame all the issues in these terms. The second conspiracy relates to the vaccine debate. Rafael talked about it. We carry out a study within the scope of the Media and Democracy projects, and we see that the intense production and dissemination of conspiratorial content through COVID-19 is serving as the basis for the fake news related to dengue vaccines this year. So the same structure of argument and the same arguments are reused in this new context. We have also observed a recovery of narratives regarding public safety, which is a very important issue also. And just to finish, we observe also this usage and this strong narrative about morality or sexualization of children. Regarding in 2018, we have here in Brazil a famous case of circulation of a fake news with a video with a supposed erotic baby model that would be distributed in schools. This case was marked as a striking example of how people could believe the most fanciful fake news. In my thesis, I worked with the database of content sent by ordinary citizens for verification by Comprova, a consortium of fact-checkers. And I identified that the sharing of this case was much smaller than its impact on the public debate in general. On the other hand, other contents about sexualization and childhood, sometimes true, but out of the context, had a large volume of sharing. In short, the overall construction of a moral panic narrative was much more complex than the case that most population was paying attention to. And that's exactly what worries me the most. This narrative continued to be disseminated in our public debate, and in a context of popularization of creation by generative AI, they have an explosive potential to spill over to the general population and directly affect the electoral process. So just to finish, our challenge is to identify ways to avoid or contain damage from this possible overflow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victor. And so to improve this communication scenario, not only affects the Brazilian elections and our democracy main pillars such as the Supreme Court, sorry, and also the violence against journalists that affect also media and journalists. We need to curb this sort of content with content moderation and proper actions, but this also can bring to us an issue of freedom of expression, regarding freedom of expression and access to information, how platforms are conducting their content moderation. And most of the times we have arbitrarily content removal and other issues that affect because of the lack of context of how these systems are built. The automated moderation ends up curbing lawful expression too. So in this sense, I would like to invite to the floor Agustina del Campo, which is, sorry, I don't know if my connection is a bit unstable. So I'd like to invite Agustina del Campo, which is the director at the Center for Studies on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information, the CELE. Agustina, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin, for that introduction. And thank you, Yasmin and Luca, for the invitation. It's such an honor to share the panel with all of you. I was following the discussion earlier today about the meaning of terms and how Nina highlighted the imports and exports of certain terms, right? And how the information integrity term is really a contested term right now. Is not yet a term of art. There's still, as Camille was saying, there are still different definitions of the term. And I was reading through one of the questions in the chat, and they were asking, how can Brazil have a say or have a role in defining information integrity? And I think it's a fascinating opportunity to actually think about the term and think for different regions, what can the term mean and what it cannot mean from a human rights standards point of view. I want to endorse Camille's distinction and maybe advocate that we don't adopt a definition of information integrity that turns it into content integrity, because content integrity is probably not something we want, and it's probably incompatible with the right to freedom of expression and to the right to access information. We don't want every content to be true. We don't want every content to be polite. We don't want every content to be politically correct. We want content to be diverse. We want content to question what we know as true. We want critical thinking about what we hold as true in society. And for that to happen, we need to protect false speech. That's a given. Not illegal false speech, but legal false speech. Scientific questions, mistakes, assumptions, opinions, which are not subject to true or false kind of determinations. So I think the definition part of this conversation is probably the most relevant going forward. How we define information integrity is really key. And in that sense, I think from the Global South, at least, we could be doing something to promote a definition of that term that allows us to put some safeguards into that term, so that our human rights and the standards that we have for speech as a human right can be preserved, and that we can together articulate a meaning where we can all go in the same direction. I was saying right now that we need people to question our truths, and we need more sources to question, to come up with critical questions. But we do have different interests depending on the different fields that we're talking about in how those truths are questioned. If we're talking about scientific publications, we have certain interests in knowing what the methodology was, what the citations are, how they are reaching the conclusions that they're reaching. If we're talking about political speech, and particularly political campaigning, to go into the second point that I want to make and final point that I want to make, we probably need to know what is coming from, what is being endorsed by political candidates. What is the opinion of the political party that the persons are representing? Which messages are being endorsed and which ones are not? How are the campaigns being run and managed? And a lot of times, elections are particularly important moments, and speech during election is particularly important. Political speech is a specially protected kind of speech. We want robust debates around the election period. But we also want certain clarities as to how the different actors are conducting themselves during the elections. And different actors during an election have different roles and different responsibilities. The government has certain responsibilities during elections that a lot of the opposition parties don't have. And the political parties as a whole have certain obligations regarding their speech that other actors maybe don't have. Interestingly, the campaigns are probably the most regulated speech around the world. If you look comparatively, there's a lot of regulation around speech during elections. There are certain restrictions on the timings, when can certain information be offered, when you cannot, political parties can no longer speak on certain issues. What kind of information should be made available by the government on elections? How can that information be distributed? There's a government obligation to distribute information about elections and how those elections are being conducted. Interestingly, there has not been that much of a debate when speaking about social media or platform regulation. There hasn't always been a distinction about the kinds of speech, the different kinds of speech that we're seeing around an election. What is advertisement? What is not advertisement? What is organic content? We have been mostly talking about content very broadly, and it has been very recently that we included certain distinctions about those different contents. And in the same way, there has been little attention paid to who the actors are and what responsibilities do the different actors have in these debates. And I think it's particularly important when we think about the kinds of regulations that we can, the kinds of actions that we would expect from intermediaries or from platforms. Do we expect the same action vis-a-vis candidates than we do for regular people? Do we expect the same conduct when it's a government official than when it's not a government official? How do speech obligations, where there are speech obligations, where the government is obliged to speak, is required to speak, should those be treated differently by the different intermediaries? Where there are obligations to archive certain public information for historic preserving purposes, how are we thinking about those? And how do we deal with those? If our concentration is on content integrity, we probably won't have space to debate these questions. So I want to touch upon two things that I think are particularly affected by these terms. There is a couple of countries who have been adopting advertisement laws, and in thinking about advertisement laws, probably the distinction of the obligations that the actors have vis-a-vis their speech is particularly important to take into account. The second issue that I want to touch upon is consumer protection. A couple of countries have been using consumer protection law to address content moderation issues, and in many cases in very problematic ways. I think going back to the definition of the term, if we are expecting information integrity in the sense of knowing how the information is being managed, how are content moderation rules being generated, how they are implemented, what technologies are being used to implement them, what general principles are used to guide that development or that enforcement. I think that is one thing, and maybe consumer protection law can help shed light over the company side, the recommender systems, the principles that are informing the company decision making, with many caveats. I want to take it back to the beginning. How we define what we want from the information integrity discussion is crucial when we're going to use these kinds of areas of law and what we're going to ask those areas of law to address. If we're going to ask them to address info integrity as an ecosystem, then probably consumer protection law can be helpful. If we're going to ask them for content integrity, then probably it will not. I will leave it at that, and thank you so much for the invitation again, and look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Agustina, for your comments. Actually, I want to make sure also that we have in our report that we will draft at the end this connection between what Agustina was mentioning and what Rafael was mentioning before about on one hand the need to contextualize and to understand which kind of speech is shared and by whom. But on the other hand, the need not only to focus on information or content itself, whether it's true or false, or whether is which type of context or of content is shared, but also how it is shared. Because actually, one of the key elements of the discussion is, on the one hand, how content is artificially spread at scale, algorithmically, and we know that the content that engages the most is frequently linked to conspiracy theories, as Victor was mentioning, or a very sensationalist headlines. But on the other hand, an element that Rafael was mentioning before, the business model, both of the platform of boosting visibility, of engaging content, because obviously this will create more engagement, which means more data that can be monetized also to refine profiles. But on the other hand, the business model, the business incentive that sharing fake content and sensationalist content creates for content creators themselves, that have a strong business incentive to redirect their business model into basically factories of lies that can easily be shared and monetized due to the pervert business logic that the large platform creates by algorithmically boosting engaging content. This is a very important element that is really absent usually from global conversations that I think we need to highlight as an outcome of our discussion. On this note, I would like to give the floor to Merrin Muhammed from IT for Change, India, where also this debate has been crucial and is currently crucial due to the electoral period in India. Merrin, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luca. I'm extremely glad to be part of this panel, and I thank the previous speakers for their very insightful interventions. So in India, where I'm coming, election right around the corner, and the recent World Economic Forum report has put India as a country at highest risk of disinformation and misinformation. While India, through its information technology rules, is taking measures to hold platforms responsible for removing illegal and harmful content and comply with transparency obligations, we are yet to have any concrete study to understand the impact of this law on stemming harmful content, including disinformation campaign on the internet. And I'm no expert on the election information ecosystem particularly and its problems, which are complex and long-standing. But what I would like to do today is to reflect briefly on how platform capitalism has foundationally changed the conditions under which public discourse happens. And then based on IT for Change, long-standing research on digital public sphere and social media governance, which is drawn from the experience of India, highlight why in addressing the information integrity issue, we must not be content with just developing procedural rules and platform accountability frameworks. While they are important, but we must also actively look for ways to bring about structural transformations and reimagine our digital public sphere by breaking free from the extractivist impulse and monopolizing tendencies of the current platform model. We find ourselves at a crossroads amidst a digital revolution that has reshaped the way we communicate, gather information, and understand the world around us. The harsh truth that if you are not paying for the product, you are the product is the reality of our experience in these digital platforms. Because for the free access that we enjoy to platforms like social media, we are turned into algorithmically manipulated users in the profit maximization drive of these platforms. And this has implications not just at an individual level in terms of our autonomy to select the content that we want to view, but it also importantly and most fundamentally impacts our capacity as citizens to participate in public discourse and democratic deliberations in a critical and agentic manner. So because social interactions on these platforms are, as we all said, subordinated to the economy of algorithmic surveillance that expels all that is irrelevant to profit. And with that goes away the values of truth and democracy in the digital age. So in such an environment where populist political narratives thrive, meaning is no longer produced through recent fact-based deliberations. And this poses a crisis for democracy, disproportionately impacting those at the margins. So efforts to address these issues have so far, including in India, mainly centered around improving the content governance of platforms with a focus on removing illegal content, requiring platforms to comply with due diligence, transparency requirements, fact-checking, proposals to hold platforms accountable, and so on. These platform regulatory measures are crucial despite its vulnerability to being co-opted by the states that are seeking to suppress dissent. But these platform regulatory measures are crucial, and in fact, more efforts should be put to better their implementations. And we have already some wonderful suggestions coming across in this discussion on how to improve them. However, they are not adequate if our goal is to build a vibrant and pluralistic public sphere, because the root cause of the problem is still not addressed, which is the predatory and abusive business model and the deep-rooted structural power of the dominant digital platforms. And challenging this paradigm necessitates structural changes and not just procedural rules to mitigate specific harms. It requires us to fundamentally reimagine the terms on which public discourse is mediated and organized on the internet currently. And as we all reflected now for this, we may even need to question whether information integrity is the goal that we need to pursue, because sometimes it's narrowly concerned with issues of only accuracy, authenticity, source, and so on. And here I would like to highlight what a recent article written by Sean Shikru and Anita Gurumurthy Anita Gurumurthy, who is a director of IT for Change, in a recent article where they opined that maybe instead of information integrity, what we may need to pursue is communicative integrity or communicative justice. Communicative justice demands that conditions that are needed for a positive cycle of communication are in practice created. And this cycle involves not only seeking, receiving, and imparting information, but also listening, being heard, understanding, learning, creating, and responding. And communicative justice should ensure that conditions needed for a vibrant and plural public sphere is created to enable such conversations to happen. But clearly, such optimization does not take place in the gamified spaces that digital platforms have become today, where public discourse is organized by attention-thirsty algorithms that viralize sensationalist content while obscuring often voices from the margin, and thereby rendering the promised freedom of internet for these communities an illusion, because their voices, though uttered, is not heard, and they are not able to engage with and contest opposing viewpoints. So as a result, many are looking to join platforms that serves their aspirations better, as evidence from the exodus to Mastodon in the wake of the Twitter fiasco, which unfortunately did not sustain. But there is a clear interest to explore alternatives to the current dominant digital platforms that have a different value offering. But as we all know, the entry barriers to these new platforms is so high. Entry barriers to platforms with alternate value propositions is so high today, and switching to them comes with a huge cost to the user in terms of loss of connections. So in such a scenario, many have argued for giving users more choice and agency over the content within the existing platforms as a practical solution. And there are also quite interesting proposals coming from various scholars and organizations like Article 19 and Forum on Information and Democracy that calls for decentralizing platforms' gatekeeping power by functionally separating the content hosting and content curating functions, thereby facilitating the emergence of a marketplace of alternate recommender algorithms to emerge that has diverse value propositions for the users to choose from. And this is definitely a great proposal, I feel, to give users more agency. I would like to have more control over the content that is being shown to me on social media pages. However, I'm not sure if giving more choices to users will advance communicative justice or make digital public sphere more inclusive and plural. And there are two reasons for my apprehension. First, there is a classic problem of choice burden and user fatigue, which ultimately end up in many users sticking to the default recommender systems. And second, and most importantly, in a world that is already afflicted with polarization, encouraging each individual to tailor their algorithms and making it more easy to find voices that echo their own views, sources that confirm their own beliefs, and political leaders that amplify their own fears may be the last thing that we want. So, in other words, this individual agency solution may not really solve the collective problem that sensationalism and divisiveness might cause. And in fact, it may even aggravate it. So therefore, in the urgent short term, I think more focus should be given to improving the default recommender systems, because that is what ultimately a lot of platform users stick to. And I also find value in using law to require platforms to dial down their attention economy logic-driven algorithms and mandatorily consider factors beyond relevance of content to the user to promote content that is more diverse, challenging, and serendipitous. In fact, we have use cases to prove that have shown that algorithms can be designed in a way that can serve content that is both relevant as well as diverse. And it may not always be a binary. So there should be clear enunciation of policy directed at platforms to employ value-sensitive recommender algorithms. And this requirement can be tailored depending upon the type of platform. For instance, for a platform that hosts news content or aggregate news, we may need to require them to ensure that content they provide also raises systemic issues, bring visibility to historically excluded voices, elevate acts of journalism from people coming from professional sources. So similarly, during elections, it should require platforms to optimize its recommendations for diversity of exposure so that users are provided with a balanced perspective on socio-political issues. Now, it may be argued that mandating diversity optimization of default algorithms is a paternalistic approach and impinges on individual autonomy. However, in a reality where even the formation of our beliefs and thoughts cannot be said to be completely independent of what has been fed to us by the platform algorithms, particularly for the younger generations, I think there is value for adopting an epistemic paternalism, especially when the profile of a user as a citizen rather than as a consumer becomes significant. For example, during elections, a user of a platform should not be just considered as a consumer, but he's also a citizen who has to make electoral choices. And therefore, regulatory efforts should also try to advance that particular interest. So while giving more choices to users and curating their content may enhance consumer sovereignty, it may not advance political sovereignty, as Cass and Steen argued, which is very critical for citizens in a democratic society to perform their civic duties. Now, I think that improving recommender algorithms is a step that should be taken in the short-term urgent measure, as a short-term urgent measure. But as a long-term strategy to restructure the digital public sphere, efforts should be taken to enable the development of public service, non-profit, community-owned media, and government should consider providing public funding for a meaningful alternative to for-profit communication platforms that has a civic mission of providing citizens with diverse content. For example, recently the government of Kerala, which is a southern state of India, launched India's first government-owned OTT platform named C-Space. So since earning profit is a prime motivation of private sector OTT platforms that mostly go for commercial movies, C-Space is set to make a mark as a medium that brings home quality films and promotes films with artistic and cultural values. So likewise, new decentralized non-profit business models are needed. We can also experiment with models like platform cooperatives. And strong public support, public funding should be provided, especially for those coming from civil society and local communities. So I think I'm running over my time. So in conclusion, to summarize my points, structural transformations are imperative to reimagine our digital public sphere and promote communicative justice. And this entails not only focusing on information accuracy and authenticity, but also fostering an environment where diverse voices are heard, understood, and valued. And efforts towards this should include rethinking default recommender algorithms to prioritize diverse and challenging content, supporting public service, non-profit, community-owned media, and encouraging alternate business models that prioritize civic values over profit. So by taking these steps, we can hope to move towards a more inclusive, pluralistic, and democratic digital realm where every individual voice matter and contribute to a thriving public discourse. So that's all from my end. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Merrin. This concept of communication justice is really inspiring, insightful. I really want to learn more about it. So now I'll give the floor to Menno Cox, who is the head of sector at the European Commission. Please, Menno, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for finding time to be with us here today. I know that you're currently in a mission. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. Can you hear me? This works well. Yes, what a pleasure. I'm on the one hand sorry for coming late, but also very happy that I got to catch quite a few of the incredible speakers that came just before me. So thank you for that. And it's also very special to join you today using communications technology from Brazil for a panel hosted by FGV Rio. We're in Brasilia at the moment, speaking precisely about these topics to the Brazilian government, civil society, and business. And I think it's very important and interesting to get the full picture, each side also having a slightly different view, of course, as always, on these extremely urgent topics. I would say that it's also a very important moment to talk about this, which is an obvious thing to say, but here, being in Brazil and hearing just how intense the discussions are, both on AI and on information integrity online or disinformation as part of the fake news bill, and seeing how the two interface, of course, makes it even more obvious and real. And just now, we heard here of a case of one of the personnel of the EU delegation being scammed with a deepfake recording of that person's child, which is, of course, one of those things that puts a lot of pressure on the debate as well. And there, I can only say that Brazil and the EU and also all other jurisdictions represented here today face what are global challenges. This is high-risk AI that is currently unassessed. It's also information integrity online, or integrity of the public discourse online, especially during election periods, and the impact of deepfakes. And I mentioned these are urgent issues, but I think there was an important point made earlier about the militarization of the information space by Camille. And I think there's the broader professionalization of the disinformation and ransomware space, which we see that in the EU coming by actors mainly from the Russian Federation, and maybe you see it in other jurisdictions also because it's a very interesting business model. But these also make the challenge greater of keeping our regulatory responses as human rights responses, those that put human rights at the core. I think in this regard, Agustina rightly called out that information integrity as a term can be problematic. And I would point to the discussions in the United Nations on the Cybercrime Convention as one obvious example of just how problematic that can be. You see how vastly different the various members would like to interpret some of the terms or the more broader notion of a cybercrime. In this regard, the Digital Services Act in the EU, interestingly, maybe doesn't define disinformation or mention it even a single time. It is very much seen as a vector, of course, for negative societal effects, including on election integrity and on public discourse. So maybe it's also interesting as an idea to focus only on the negative societal effects, because that allows disinformation and misinformation in a sort of non-intentional or illegal way to continue to also feed the information space. Then quickly on the respective regulatory responses in the EU and Brazil, because I thought it might be interesting for the participants to also hear about some of the insights. And I think there we saw that the EU and Brazil converge in their responses, mainly in the sense that both sides recognize regulation is necessary, which is already a big step, both on AI and on online platforms, notwithstanding strong pressure, especially from business as well, to keep especially AI regulation very light. I think we also converge in a conviction that we need to base our rules on universal values. And I think here we are greatly helped also by the UNESCO guidelines for the governance of digital services, for instance. And indeed, I would say both the AI bills in Brazil and Europe and our online platform regulations in draft here and or in Brazil and now adopted in Europe are still human rights framework legislations. Now, as regards maybe challenges, it's also good to be humble. I think both the EU and Brazil and everywhere in the world, we face a major challenge to successfully support and also bring together the required networks of strong independent regulators, both digital and sectoral, and to bring together civil society networks and to inform a necessary regulatory dialogue and civil society oversight. Because if we do succeed in adopting human rights framework legislations, respecting our universal values, then they will inherently require this and enable this regulatory dialogue with civil society to inform the actual response. The laws only facilitate the response. And in this regard, in the EU, the AI office and the Commission's platform directorate, where I work, will both need to leverage these extensive networks. And we need to show that we can successfully deliver the required, as a regulator, the required guidance and enforcement actions where systemic issues are spotted, precisely to coordinate and build a global evidence base. And this was mentioned earlier as well, that we still today lack a lot of the evidence required in all of the sectors and parts of the society affected by disinformation and other issues to also inform our collective response. I think there is a general concern when we talk about these issues around also on AI, around expertise and computing power being concentrated in the global north. And I think, again, we need to look at regulation on these topics also as a way to improve knowledge and capabilities everywhere. And transparency in this regard can be a key enabler. And I think it is very interesting to see that under the Digital Services Act, we've seen the first statement or transparency reports from very large online platforms, and they have already helped regulators in other jurisdictions challenge some of the statements made by online platforms there. And we also, of course, have a statement of reasons database with 15 billion statements of reasons now, which is non-geofenced and fully available for global research. And these sort of tools everywhere would help our collective knowledge and understanding of the phenomenon. And I think this is maybe good to bring out once more. When you have a global evidence base that is kept up to date, you can inform the response as a society on an ongoing basis under the notion of a risk assessment, right? That you have the rule that requires a risk assessment, but it is technology neutral, and we can keep pace as society with fast changing issues by having benchmarking evidence and an informed discussion on risk mitigation measures. So that's very promising, yet also very challenging. And this brings me to a point about enforcement. I think what we heard here this week in Brazil is that enforcement is a key concern, both for the existing data protection legislation as well as for a future AI and platform bill. It's both regarding staffing and funding. And I think this will be the same or true elsewhere in the world, and it's also no different in the EU. And I think here we can really reframe the debate as one of us having to collectively face this emergency so that we can build that required evidence base and have that discussion, including on terminology, to make sure we have a proportionate response. One final thought, I think we touched upon this in the last intervention. It is clear, of course, that the response goes beyond regulation and maybe, or obviously also starts before regulation. And I would still want to point to the Digital Markets Act also in the EU and how it interfaces with the Digital Services Act. Because you have seen that Facebook has threatened to remove news media from its platforms in Australia. But that response does not necessarily affect the way how the Digital Markets Act intends to bring new ways to users for news media and other information professionals. It, for instance, will mandate societal oversight over the very complex advertising chains, and it will also offer side loading and interoperability rights, for instance, regarding operating systems for web streaming apps. And this could be a more technologically neutral approach to supporting the online information space. And Merrin had this great intervention, mentioned or hinted at this, I felt, and to her point on user choice, the DMA looks at the user choice on both sides of the platform ecosystem, both the end user and the professional user, and maybe that reinforces the effect to some extent. So we're also hopeful that this can be an important addition, a tool to support this threat to democracy that we face, and to support us countering it and to informing our global discussion. I think it's very important, and we're also, of course, very grateful that this is on the G20 agenda of the Brazilian presidency, and look forward to continuing discussing it. So thank you, Yasmin and colleagues, for organizing and inviting me.
Thank you very much. And as we started with 10 minutes of delay, we will use this extra last 10 minutes for final considerations and to reply to the several questions we have received from the audience. We have pasted the questions in the chat for all the remaining speakers. A couple of them have already left due to different time zone or other commitments. So for those who are still here, let's say that the main trends around the questions, the 5 or 6 questions that have been shared by the audience, are about, one, which kind of effective solutions could be put forward to truly effectively regulate information integrity. And actually this connects very well with what Menno was mentioning, the question not only of elaborating regulation, but also implementing it. We had this similar conversation this week during the EU-Brazil digital dialogue, speaking about AI, precisely the need for also having effective implementation, not only regulation, and two, the looming question of AI synthetic content generated to generative AI, and how this could be effectively regulated, if it could be regulated at all. If you want to respond, please use your hand feature of the Zoom platform. So otherwise, we can go in order to have final remarks from the speakers. Does anyone want to go first? Don't be shy, please. If no one wants to dare going first, now I will put my professor hat and I will call you. So let's start. Okay, Camille, please.
Thank you so much. And I'd be very brief just on this question of regulation. It's been said, it really depends also on context, and we've remember long discussions with Agustina on that, on depending on the country, the institutions that you have, the respect for the rule of law, the independence of the regulatory bodies that you have in your country, it will really depend. And I can understand that, being based in Europe and with the work of the Commission, I'm pretty confident with the work that is being done, because we have this strong democratic infrastructure behind us. So regulation is not too scary. I can understand how in other contexts, thinking of our vice chair Nigat Dad in Pakistan, for example, I perfectly understand why certain recommendations that we have, she would not agree, because she's thinking of what could be the risks if these recommendations would be implemented in her country. So there is, I believe, this balance. We need to be careful around this, and we've seen also how some authoritarian regimes have sort of copy-pasted some pieces of regulation from Europe to not really have a healthier public debate, but to suppress or to censor independent voices. This has happened multiple times. So voila, in a few words, just we need to be careful. We need to be adaptive, responsive to different contexts.
So we have Agustina and then Ana Cristina.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't unmute. Big plus one to Camille. I think, given the long conversation we had about defining terms, I think a key part of finding and implementing solutions that are respectful of human rights and that are what we want to aim at. I think there are three things that are important. One of them, to me, is distinguishing actors within the ecosystem. One of the beauties of the term information ecosystem or information integrity is that it deals with the many different voices that make up the information space. And those are journalists, intermediaries, politicians, individuals, my aunt, and also my kids, and also the school, and also it's pretty much a collective effort, and we have different roles, different duties towards our speech in different contexts. So there are the three things that I think are key. One is distinguishing actors, the second, distinguishing duties, and the third, probably distinguishing context. So in finding solutions for the digital information ecosystem, I think solely focusing on platforms can be a big challenge if we're not looking at the other pieces of the puzzle and implementing them. And it can give way to further abuse.
Thank you so much, Agustina. Ana Cristina, do you want to add to Agustina's comment?
Yes, I building on what Agustina was saying, I actually was thinking that in this conversation, this word multi-stakeholder approach at some point it didn't rise out, but I think it is very, very, very important to consider that when we're dealing with this, it's not only about being open or being diverse, it's also being inclusive and trying to understand that this is not only that it's affecting the technical community or the digital rights groups, but it's also like what we saw during the consultation process is that it's of interest of everyone, from refugee groups to feminist groups to children groups, etc., that are intending to be part of this discussion and to broaden the scope of what we understand about information integrity and how this information ecosystem is affecting their lives and their well-being. So I think this is a very important point. But I also wanted to raise that even though we always think about regulation as statutory regulations, there are many places in the world where PDA councils have done a great work trying to create self-regulatory mechanisms to try to create a way of making a trustworthy information ecosystem. For instance, in Africa, they are actually working a lot on these issues in their electoral context, thinking on a super election year. Or for instance, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Media and Information Council has also tried to counter some of the negative effects that content moderation has created to human rights, etc. So I think it is important also to see that the governance system should be coherent, not only like thinking a whole of society approach, but thinking that there is not only like the independent regulation, the statutory regulation that should very much work, but that should be working together with other forms of regulation that are already established and that are working well. So it is important to also bring together all this expertise to have this on board. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ana Cristina. Menno, want to jump in? Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. I wanted maybe to add one term or idea to the debate, which is professionalizing things. And I don't mean, of course, civil society actors and regulators doing the job they already know very well, but professionalizing our collective response to the phenomenon, gaining a better understanding, a more systematic understanding, more systematic cooperation regionally, nationally, globally. This is, of course, what we're doing and what we're talking about today. But maybe it's good to repeat that we just, as with data protection, it took many decades for that to be a reflex also in the EU for business and citizens, for regulators, still ongoing. So maybe we need to yes, recognize that it takes some time, but with the urgently professionalize. Thank you.
Thank you, Menno. Rafael.
Hi, thank you. Just in terms of recommendations, I was thinking of some points. First, I think we need to tax the platforms and use those resources to incentivize high quality journalism production. I think this is feasible, and we can build some institutions in which we can find some common standards for what is good journalism, what is not, and use this money to incentivize these practices. I also like the suggestion of that Merrin made, talking about the recommendations of Article 19 on decoupling the recommendation systems of the platforms in terms of, I think we have to push forward in terms of interoperability and trying to create an ecosystem that is more diverse than just the big techs controlling everything. And also, I think platforms have to be co-responsible of everything that they are paying for. Since a content is published in the platform and the platform is paying for the content, it doesn't matter where the money comes from, if it's from advertising, etc. But if the platform is paying for some content, platforms have to be co-responsible for that. This will not solve all the problems, but I think this will lead to an ecosystem in which platforms are more paying attention to everything that is running on their networks and the contents that they are recommending. Also, not everything, not only the things that they are paying for, but also the content they are recommending. I think they should be co-responsible for those. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Victor.
Thank you, Yasmin. Thank you, Luca. Just complementing what Rafael is saying. The last few days, we Meta announces the end of Crowdtangle, and this is a very important tool that we use to understand how this information flows happens in the Facebook and Instagram in particular. So I believe that the transparency in data and the possibility to catch data of the public debate in general, and not only by segmented lists of actors. It's very important to explore more and to discover the main trends of disinformation in social media, so we can solve or at least think about some solutions for this problem.
Thanks, Victor. Merrin?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I would like to second what Rafael talked about of taxing the platforms and using that money to invest in more journalistic content. And I think that's a really good idea. And like these measures, I think we should, along with platform regulatory measures that we are currently undertaking, we should also think about ways to decentralize the platform power. So one, as I said before, while decoupling the content moderation, content curation functions as have been proposed is really good. It should also be considered in the context of different countries, like for India, where a lot of people from rural areas are using these platforms. I don't think many of them have the digital literacy enough, that is enough to distinguish, to examine which recommender system is useful to them and to select one. So they will fall back to sticking to the default recommender system, which is engagement based and which promotes sensationalist content. So there is a need to also improve the current default recommender systems, and that will vary depending on different platforms and different moments of time. Like during an election, we may need a different ranking. I don't know how we can achieve that. Maybe law can help, but improving default recommender systems and bringing more alternatives to the current platform model with public funding and public support is one way. It's not a fancy, I mean, it may be thought of as an out of the box idea, but there have been experiments, and it's not really palatable to the current conventional market thinking, but we should think about these alternative platform models with civic values to emerge, to really restructure the digital public sphere. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much to everyone for this final bullet points that we will make sure to include in the final report that will be published next week of this webinar. Let me thank you very much also both our partners in the Media and Democracy Project that actually is, I also should disclose, is funded by the European Union. So I hope also Menno is pleased by the very good return on investment that the European Union is having. And I also want to, on a less fun note, thank very much also our partners, the UN, University, Electronic Government Unit, Consumers International, and IDEC, the Brazilian Consumer Protection Institute, that have been helping organizing this webinar. This series of webinar on digital policies in the G20, which is part also of the side events of the T20, the group of think tanks of the G20, will continue in the next month. At the end of next month, we will have a webinar on meaningful connectivity, where some of the points that we mentioned today regarding access and which kind of access exists in the Global South will be raised. Of course, we will have another one on platform governance, where we will also discuss some of the key elements that we raised today about interoperability and economic regulation of platform. And finally, in June, we will have one on cybersecurity in the G20, where we will discuss also some of the issues raised today in terms of militarization of the information space. Thank you very much for all the excellent inputs, comments, and considerations of today. Excellent presentation from our speakers, excellent question from our audience. I wish you an excellent afternoon or evening, wherever you are in the world watching this now.